Hi, I'm Hope Dector, the Creative Director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I'm happy to be welcoming you to Abolition on the Ground, reporting from the movement to defund the police. Tonight, we'll be hearing a conversation between incredible lawyers and organizers at the forefront of the movement to defund the police. Angelica Chazaro, Erica Perry, Andrea Richie, and Dean Spade. I'll keep my remarks as brief as possible, but I want to offer some notes of thanks and accessibility information before I turn things over to Dean. First, a land acknowledgement. Tonight's event is taking place online, but we are all physically located someplace, and we recognize that all land is Indigenous land. Barnard College is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lenape people. In terms of accessibility, you can find a link to access live transcription for this event directly under the video in the YouTube video description or on the BCRW event page. Thank you to Rebecca Koester from Total Caption for providing the live transcription. Our ASL interpreters for tonight's event are Kat Ridley and Jessica Ganez. Thank you both for providing this essential service. Another thing we'll be doing tonight for accessibility is visual descriptions. Each of our speakers will self-describe as they start to speak. I'll model that now. I am a genderqueer-looking white person with short dark hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a bright orange sweater and I'm sitting in front of a dark blue wall. We're planning for tonight's conversation to take place for 1.5 hours, ending around 8:30 Eastern Time, 5:30 Pacific. If you have any questions for any of the speakers, you can type it into the YouTube chat. We'll be collecting any questions there for the Q&A that will take place towards the end of the event. This event is made possible by the Patricia Wismer Professorship in Gender and Diversity at Seattle University. Special thanks to Natasha Martin and Teresa Ehrenfeit at Seattle University. I also want to thank my coworkers at BCRW for all of their work, including Elizabeth Castelli, Pam Phillips, Avi Cummings, Miriam Neptune, and especially Sophie Kreitzberg, who's coordinating so much of the work that goes into these events behind the scenes, including managing the social media and communications during the event. And to BCRW student research assistant Neela Cooper, who is working with Sophie behind the scenes tonight. I hope you will check out some of the incredible BCRW programming lined up for the next few months, including the annual Scholar and Feminist Conference that is currently underway. This year's theme is Living in Madness, Decolonization, Creation, Healing, and we're looking forward to upcoming events, including a mad mapping workshop with Fireweed Collective, and conversations with scholars and artists on Mad Blackness and the Art of Madness. Later in April, we'll be hosting another event in partnership with Seattle University featuring Dean Spade in conversation with Circe Mendez about transformative justice responses to gender-based violence and campus violence. More information and registration for those events are available on bcrw.barnard.edu. And now I'm happy to be welcoming back to BCRW Dean Spade, who will be introducing our other speakers. Dean Spade is a former resident and longtime collaborator with BCRW, most recently producing the Building Capacity for Mutual Aid Groups workshop and video series. Dean has also worked with BCRW to create videos and programming on prison abolition, queer liberation, disability justice, and transformative justice. Dean is the author of Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, as well as Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law. Dean teaches at Seattle University School of Law and has been working in social movements to end prisons, borders, poverty, and war for over 2 decades. Dean, I'll bring you on now and we can get started.
Thanks so much, Hope. I'm Dean. I'm a white person sitting in front of a white wall. I have dark hair and a mustache. And there's a painting behind me, but it's hard to see it very clearly. I'm really grateful to Natasha Martin and Teresa Ehrenfeit from Seattle U, who Hope mentioned, who've helped me coordinate this series as part of the Wismer Professorship. and super grateful to Hope and Sophie and everyone at BCRW who are lovely to work with on so many things, and to Jess and Kat for interpreting today, and to our captioner. I usually join in from Duwamish land, Seattle, but today I'm in Los Angeles on Gabrielino Tongva land. And I've just been really excited to bring together a conversation with these three people who you'll be hearing from today. I'll give a little context and then I'll share a little bit about each of them. It feels really important to me that we be doing a lot of work to reflect on campaigns to defund the police that have unfolded since the disruptive, spontaneous militant actions in the streets that started in late May, early June 2020. That moment sparked a lot, and we saw our opponents really spinning out. We saw the emergence of a lot of new promises from city and county councils to defund police, from universities and other institutions to make reparations pledges and bring the study of Black struggle and liberation into curricula, and from various other extractive institutions to do their part to stop anti-Black police terror and make Black life livable. Since then, we've had almost 2 years to see new levels of what tired, old, familiar backpedaling and lip service looks like. To chart the vast distances between what's promised and what's delivered. And to dive into new fronts of the work to force implementation in hostile city council chambers, courtrooms, and boardrooms. Feels to me like everything is up in the air, as it has always been. But there's new players and new plays at hand from what we were dealing with before 2020. The very idea of abolition in some ways went mainstream in a way that I think none of us could have predicted, even if we'd long awaited, anticipated, and worked for this idea to surface for more people. And the powers that be are relentlessly working to right their ship in the face of this and to re-legitimize policing and criminalization with surface reforms. And as usual, all we have on our side is the well-being of all the people on the planet and the utter fragility of our opposition's pyramid schemes. To me, it feels essential to observe how significant the impact of the 2020 uprising has been. It changed the political weather in a way that only disruptive action by huge numbers of people fighting cops in the streets can do. And it feels essential that we celebrate our victories. The prison expansion projects, we've forced them to cancel. The prisoners our movements have forced them to release. The dollars that have been carved out of police budgets and reallocated to human needs. But we also have to track the betrayals and co-optations with care. We have to study every counter move that our opposition makes and share every lesson learned across the states, countries, cities, counties, circulating abolitionist wisdom and backing up each other's campaigns. The people that we're in conversation with this evening are people who are doing that. My hopes for this conversation is to reflect on this moment and try to think broadly about where we are and where we're going. And I feel like these are three really great people to help guide us in such a conversation. So just to say a little bit about each of them, Angelica Chasaro is an organizer with Decriminalize Seattle and an assistant professor at the University of Washington School of Law, where she teaches critical race theory, poverty law, professional responsibility, and immigration law. Erica Perry is a Nashville native, committed to community-driven and movement-led abolition of the prison industrial complex. Erica has worked with organizers and advocates throughout Tennessee and nationwide to create alternatives to police and jails, fight for local budgets that invest in the community and not police, and organize to build power. Erica is a movement lawyer within Black Nashville Assembly and Southern Movement Committee. Andrea Richie is a Black lesbian immigrant whose research, litigation, organizing, and policy advocacy has focused on policing and criminalization of women and LGBT people of color. She's the co-founder with Miriam Kaba of Interrupting Criminalization. She's a brilliant writer. She's the author of the book Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, and the co-author of No More Police: A Case for Abolition, and of Say Her Name: Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women. And another really important book, Queer Injustice: The Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States. She works with dozens of groups around the country to support campaigns to divest from policing and invest in community safety through Interrupting Criminalization and the Community Resource Hub. So I want to kind of ask each of these three kind of a big overview question, and then we'll have a bit more discussion amongst us about some follow-up questions. But I wanted to start with Erica. My question for Erica is, would you tell us about the work you've been involved in to defund the police in Nashville? And what's the context there like, and what are you finding?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I just appreciate being in the space and learning with folks and sharing some of our work that we've been doing in Nashville. And so I'm Erica. I'm Black. I have medium dark brown skin, medium length Black locks with brown tips. And I'm sitting in front of a white wall with you can see a bit of the fan. So I'll start by answering the question, and also I use any pronouns. And so I think to answer the question, I just want to frame and surface some of the organizations that are leading the work to defund the police in Nashville. And so in 2019, late 2019, Andrew Krings brought together a group of organizers in Nashville around Invest Divest to really lead an Invest Divest coalition. And so we started that grounding ourselves in our principles and values, and named that we would be abolitionists, and also would be anti-capitalist, and that we would work for a city that created a budget that reflected those values. And then in January 2020, I was at Law for Black Lives, Center for Practical Democracy, Policy Link, and BYP 100 came down and trained Southern organizers around Invest Divest. And, we hadn't yet started saying defund, at least not that I know of. But we were like, we're going to organize around Invest Divest and really create a people's budget. And so we worked on building that budget throughout the first few months of 2020, and really launched our campaign in May at the start of the 2020 uprisings. And so we're able to build on the work, the demand in the streets, which was defund the police, and the work we have been doing to really divest from courts, cops, and cages, and invest in our people. And I think it's important to name who was a part of that. And so we had organizations who were led by formerly incarcerated people who were like, we can't just say defund the police. It has to be like courts and cages, right? So we're talking about juvenile court. We talking about the district attorney's office, all aspects of the prison industrial complex, which was quite a bit. But I think like as we look to 2020, our work has gotten stronger. And I think like our demand has always been clear. Like, we don't want no more money. We want to take money from these institutions, right? But now I think at the same time, we're saying like, take this particular thing, here's the particular way you can take it. And also this is what we're building up and this is what we're building towards. So one thing that's important to name when we talk about the context of defund in Nashville, and this other folks probably experienced that too, but one thing that kept coming up was we had engaged in surveys, people moving assemblies to create a people's budget. We even gave people a report so they knew what, when they talked about moving money, they knew what they were basing it off of. So we gave a report on the mayor's budget and trends in city government, in the way the city government had been spending our money. And still elected officials, who's supposed to be the most progressive city council that was ever elected, I think was supposed to have the most Black people, was like, actually, you know, it's only a group of white people are saying defund. And we were like, what? It's literally being led by Black people. And we were like, okay, we hear that. So we went and out of that, you know, we gave birth to the Black National Assembly, who was like, we're going to specifically organize Black people in Nashville, in the Middle Tennessee area, even folks who had been displaced from Nashville, around abolition. And as a part of that, we were like, hey, y'all, what are the issues impacting Black people? And how can we organize around a people's budget to do that and take money from cops, courts, and cages? What do we want? And so folks were saying education, housing, and public safety. And while the demand that we have consistently had has been divest and defund, we also knew that we had to really go deep in what it means to have community-driven public safety. And so we kind of made that decision after organizers. So we're having hard conversations. We're talking to people who are both like, yes, we don't like, I don't know if I can cuss, but we're like, we ain't fucking with the police. I'm seeing my family and church members in the streets who are really clear about what they want. And I'm also hearing community members who are also like, yo, but somebody just held a gun to my head while I was locking up the store the other day. Like, we're holding all of these and we're saying, no, but the police isn't isn't the answer. And it hasn't saved us. It's not going to save us. But also, y'all understand the role of the FOP. So it's not just the FOP we're up against, but we also saw the district attorney's office organizing, right? Organize when it came to us trying to stop investments from the prison industrial complex. The other thing I just want to name, that as a part of the Black National Assembly, which is kind of what we started as a way to really organize Black people in Nashville, because as you were talking, I was just thinking about, I was like grounded in that summer and the work we were doing and moved by so much, by the energy that we had. And I remember thinking like, yo, we got to invite these people in the organization, right? We got to invite these people into like a political home to work with us. And that's what the assembly came to be. And we're still trying to activate folks who we saw in the streets to be like, yo, it didn't stop there. And there are many folks who were looking for a place to like take and channel their rage. And so we made that invitation to folks. And so I'll just lay a bit about I'm looking at my clock. All right, I got like 4 more minutes. I just want to lay a bit of the foundation of what it had looked like for us to engage in that. And so we decided we were going to do a political agenda because we were so angry at city council. Again, this was supposed to be the most progressive city council. And when it came time to really make a decision to not give any more money from the police, to defund the police after we had organized community members to hold up city council for 12 hours, the public hearing process, folks were very clear. It was working class people, teachers, people of all walks of life who were like, defund the police. And, you know, city council and the mayor just refused to do it. They created a task force. They did fire the police chief, but we were like, we still have the police. And so we were like, no, we want to put people in city council who will reflect our values and the policies that we want to see happen in our community. And so we started experimenting with that. And we're creating a political agenda, and a part of that has been really focusing on community safety. And so we were like, yo, we engaged in workshops, and people are really clear. They're like, we don't want the police to respond when we're having a mental health crisis. We don't want the police to respond when we get in a fight with our cousin. The police aren't going to do anything after our car is taken. We actually want community-driven solutions. And I'll say, I want to name that in 2020, I don't think we were seeing community-driven because we weren't yet ready for them to co-opt our language and our work and hand us back something that was a totally different version of the programs that we were advocating for. So in 2021, we sharpened our language and we started saying, yo, give us community-driven and community accountable public goods and programs. And I think last year we started saying that, but we hadn't yet created the programs. This year, I believe we'll have programs that we actually want to make sure our public tax dollars go to, things that we deserve to be able to experiment and see if it works. And we also named that because we saw nonprofits who are actually more caught up with elected officials than they are with the people who they're supposed to be working with, and less accountable to the people. And so we started that. We created draft policies via our assemblies. And that just really meant we spent time talking to people about what programs do we want in our community? What does it look like for us to have dignified housing? And people kept going back to, well, we want community. We want people to be able to take care of each other's housing without getting pushed out. We really struggled around, I'm just thinking about the defund, removing school resource officers from schools and taking away surveillance. And folks were like, no, that's a safe, that. They thought of that as a safety net. So we were like, yo, if that didn't exist, what would we create? And people came back again with community, ways for community members to work with students who are maybe having challenging behavior to help them work through that process. That didn't mean they'd be locked up or we would need more cameras in the school, and a way for us to get school resource officers out. And so, we struggled within our assemblies. We created proposals, edit. I'm with EDIT, because I can't say the word right now. And then we created survey as another way to engage a mass amount of people around those policy programs. And so that'll be what we use to create the political agenda. And I just want to drive us really quickly. And so the agenda is both to make the public safety agenda is what we're using to make our people's budget this year, at least in the Black National Assembly, but also we have judicial and district attorney races. And, we're holding ourselves through that contradiction because we're realizing that the district attorney and judges have so much power and can give our people 51 years in prison, separating our families, and give a police officer 3 years, right? That's a lot of power. And so we were like, how do we start to mitigate the harm of our people getting swept away and taken from us? And we've learned a lot. I mean, at least I can say myself, and watching other organizers try to engage in progressive DA or prosecutors campaign. And so we're really trying to hold the line as we engage in this, but we at least have a foundation to say, can you at least agree to a bit of this? Not that you'll get our support, but how do we push you as a part of our campaign? And then what does escalation look like if you can't agree to significantly reduce the size and scope of the criminal legal system? And so I say that because we're not engaging with the chief of police, but at least with the district attorney, be like, you need to limit what you're doing. We don't want any more courts. Folks are like, well, we want a court for mental health court. We want a veterans court. And we're like, if you leave people alone and get them what they need, we won't need, leave us alone. We don't want any more courts. And so I said it to say, because we're engaging in the judicial election race now. So we're planning a candidate forum because we want to hear from elected officials, current sitting judges, and the current district attorney, and people who are running to say, what is your plan to do about these issues with the criminal legal system, and also call them out for how they're driving them. And then again, at the same time, fight for a people's budget that defunds the courts, cops, and cages. And I think right now we're really trying to experiment with what it would look like to create programs that invest in our people and that actually address harm. So I hope I explained a bit of it. I think 2020, we were new to it, learned quite a bit. and what it would look like to engage in moving city council. They weren't moving. So a lot of our work has been focused on 2023. But in that quest to engage in, I think, electoral justice work, we're just learning a lot about what it means for us to invest in solidarity economy. And shout out to Denzel, who's on here, who's been leading that work at the Highlander Center, but really invest in programs outside of the state, because even when we talk about investing in public goods, we just got a memo last week that the Metro Health Department is full of people who are racist and homophobic. I mean, surprise, but right, that's the work that we're sifting to and having really difficult conversations with our people, strategizing and experimenting and seeing what works.
Thank you so much, Erica. I love hearing you run it down. Like it is so radical to have a conversation with a group of lawyers who want to abolish courts. Like it really is. So it feels so good. Speaking of which, Angelica, will you give us a bit of a report back from your work in Seattle to defund the Seattle police and close the Seattle Municipal Court, and what kinds of things you're learning?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dean. I'll start by saying I'm a light-skinned Mexican woman with wavy dark brown hair and silver after these past 2 years. I'm wearing bright red glasses, a dark blue short sleeve shirt, and gold hoop earrings. There's a window next to me and a white bookcase and a mirror visible behind me. I'm calling in from Seattle, which is occupied Duwamish land. And the Duwamish Tribal Council chairwoman, Cecile Hansen, always reminds us that the Duwamish were the first people to be homeless in this city. You know, the very first laws passed by Seattle's first city council before they briefly disbanded were laws criminalizing the presence of the Duwamish in the city, with an exception for domestic workers. Just put a cherry on it. So it's easy to draw a direct through line between that fact and the fact that today, Native people in Seattle are the group most likely to be stopped by the police. So they are 9 times more likely per capita to be stopped by SPD than white people are, right? So there have been people who've been fighting this fight since the actual creation of this idea of the city of Seattle, right? So I'm going to use some of my time to give you some background on what we've won most recently in Seattle. Let you know some factors that led to our wins, and then try to give you some updates on what's happening right now. So I've lived here since 2006 and been involved in struggles to push back against all forms of criminalization and surveillance. Along with a lot of other people, I've worked on shutting down the Immigrant Detention Center about 45 minutes from Seattle, to stop the construction of a new youth jail here in Seattle, and also to stop the construction of a new police bunker. And so all of these fights and more had been happening and are some of the background for the work leading up to 2020. And I think they're the context for the possibilities that opened up. I'll tell you a little bit of what we won and then how I think we got there, or some things, some ideas of how we got there. So Seattle was the only city to defund the police 2 years in a row. We saw SPD's budget go from $409 million before the uprising in 2020 to $363 million in 2021, and then now $355 million in 2022. Our city has gone from funding 1,422 cops in 2020 to funding 1,225 cops this year. We've also eliminated position authority for 140 cops. So there's 140 jobs that the police can't ask for funding for anymore. We civilianized 911 dispatch, and we also moved parking enforcement and domestic violence advocates out of the police department. We moved $30 million out of SPD and towards a participatory budgeting process, which is a process where regular people get to make decisions about how to spend the city budget. We also got $3 million for a Black-led research process to inform the participatory budgeting process. We also pressured the city to fund 40 new organizations to develop non-police ways of responding to harm and violence, and everything from relationship skill classes to violence interruption classes have been receiving city money for the past 2 years. We can talk about whether that's a good idea or not, but we did it and we're trying it. So how did this happen? I think there were a few things. I think undeniably the biggest factor, of course, was just the uprising on the ground, right? There is none of this would have happened without people's relentless protesting every day for months, right? There was morning march, a group that just marched every single morning. There was evening march. There were one of the police precincts was abandoned because people took it over and took over the surrounding neighborhood for a few months, right? There were marches directly on the mayor's home. There were marches directly on city council members' homes. Like, city council members' aides would be texting and being like, why is this person outside of the council member? I thought we had done what you want. I was like, have you defunded the police by 50%? Not yet. Okay, well, they're going to keep showing up at your house, right? And so that discomfort that was created for our elected officials, I think, was undoubtedly the number one reason that anything shifted, right? Second, I think we made really bold demands. Like our initial demands were to defund the police by 50%, to invest in Black and Brown communities, and to release all protesters without exception, right? So that willingness to make the demands, although we didn't know what the endpoint would be, and to hold fast to that number, I think served us, right? I think it also served us that the city wasn't new to these kinds of bold demands, right? So Ruthie Gilmore has said, you don't find a public, you make a public. And so we've been making a public for abolition and abolitionist demands in Seattle for a while now, right? Like when Dean and I started working on the No New Youth Deal campaign back in 2012, we had a very small group of organizations who were willing to sign on to the idea that Seattle and King County, where we live, could have no youth incarceration at all. It took 8 years to get, up to 200 organizations who finally signed on to do that. And it was asking some of the same people over and over again and really bringing them along with us. Same thing, to get people signed on to shut down the immigrant detention center in Tacoma, rather than like improve conditions or pay for more lawyers to represent everyone, but just to shut it down. That took a while. But that work paid off, right? Because within hours, literally, of putting out our demands to defund the police by 50%, we had hundreds of organizations, including the ones who we had been working on for years, making them our public, signed on, right? And so that made it very difficult for city leaders to ignore us, because they couldn't say, well, look at these other reasonable people who are asking not for that, or who are asking for accountability, or asking for something different, right? No, we had everyone, so that their usual suspects of like who would sort of help divide us, it just wasn't there. We had captured those folks. We also had an unprecedented coalition, right? So, we all know the places where the violence of police cuts most deeply are also the places in our city that suffer from the biggest underinvestment, right? So like the neighborhoods with no sidewalks, where kids literally get hit by cars walking home from school on the road, are also the neighborhoods here where the police spends the most money, right? So we formed a coalition called Solidarity Budget in 2021. This was actually in 2020. This was environmental justice, housing justice, transportation justice, indigenous sovereignty, labor. All of these folks were already signed on to our defund SPD by 50% call. And they were also, a lot of those folks who had worked on the very first tax on Amazon, right? Our first progressive income tax in the city. The city was trying to pit us against each other. And we said, no deal. We actually are all on the same side. We know that we need to push for more progressive taxation, and also that much of our city's funding has been tied up in policing and courts and cages for so long. And so we all win. Like, we all get more sidewalks if we defund the police and the courts, right? And everybody wins. And so, we took Mariam Kaba's advice that everything worthwhile is done with other people, and have really discovered that like everything worthwhile is done with other movements, right? Like, we are really all just like one big movement now. It also took, and I'll just be honest about this part, like the intense, like very laborious work of like a committed core of people, mostly unpaid, using their skills, right? And so we had like a lot of like computer geeks and researchers just like going deep on the data to try to like sift through hours of city budget hearings and documents, and reading every single memo SPD came out with, and just like cutting through the bullshit, calling on Andrea and her team at Interrupting Criminalization over and over again. And we know that plus the uprising got us to the first year's cuts. I think like the afterglow of the uprising / fear in the hearts of city council and the mayor got us to the second year cuts, but also the follow through that was just, that implementation piece you were talking about, Dean, just the intense follow through, the like unsexy, maybe to others, work of getting into the weeds of city budgets and city governance, like having people signed up to listen to every single city council hearing and reporting back and like raising red flags for where they were trying to slip money back in and constantly pushing back, right? And I think the final thing that got us here is this refusal to fall for liberal traps, right? So part of that was like that coalition building I already talked about that we'd already done. And then also just like saying no over and over again every time we were offered a carrot. So like, do you want to be part of this task force? Nope, no task forces. In fact, here's a report showing the last 10 task forces and the ways that they were, basically ways to get rid of us. And this time we're not going away. Would you take this much of a cut? Nope, no compromises. Just basically saying no to them over again and all their terrible ideas for repackaging our demands back to us. And yes, to like our vision, which especially once we had solidarity budget was like very clear, right? And like refusing not just their offers, but like refusing the very like premise of like their questions, right? So like they would say things like, we can't cut SPD positions until there's like a civilian equivalent that exists and is proven to work. And we'd be like, nope, like not every police function needs a civilian replacement. And also when people's basic needs are met, the need for 911 response goes down. So no, you're not going to trick us into like having you move all this money from SPD into like a special police social worker, right? Like, no, we refuse the premise of your question. No, thank you. Like defund the police by 50%, right? They would say things like, yes, we're reimagining police, but while we do that, our goal is to reduce police response times while maintaining police presence in the community because we have to build trust. Like the trust has been broken. We're like, nope. Imagining safety for the first time, because there has never been safety for Black and Indigenous communities with the city, means reducing the contacts between police and the public as much as possible. We don't want more cops. We don't want cops that look like our communities. We don't want Black cops, queer cops, trans cops. Like we want no interactions between police and community because that just leads to violence and death, right? Same thing, as we reimagine police, we need to hire more BIPOC officers. We need to retain our newer officers because we need to reflect the communities that people come into contact with. Again, like no dice. Like we want to create a city in which police, no matter what their identity is, aren't there. And the few that remain are not keeping Black and other marginalized people in check through threats of arrest, incarceration, violence, and death, like whoever they are, right? And then finally, the one that's been trickiest because there's folks who've really invested in this in a long time, and our liberal folks in charge know this, is police accountability, right? So Seattle has made such good strides in police accountability since we entered a consent decree over 10 years ago now. So we need to continue with this important work and not get distracted, by defund, right? And it's like, no, accountability reforms have failed over and over and over again. And SPD is actually working functioning as designed, right? So we're not going to waste more money. And in fact, we would specifically go after the funding for the trainings, right? Like funding for implicit bias trainings and other trainings that we know they're just pouring through and people just hear these buzzwords and decide, oh, this is the thing that will fix police. So rejecting those premises, I think, was helpful. What's happening now, let me see, in 2 minutes or less. So the city's kind of doubling down on their premises and we're doubling down on ours, right? We had an election where we saw a Republican city attorney be elected for the first time in many, many years in Seattle. And we also saw a person running for mayor who was elected with promises to like not defund the police anymore, right? And what these folks are doing together is saying, we're not going to cut SPD anymore. We're going to start throwing more money at them. And we're going to push for what is essentially broken windows policing, right? So there's a new police operation called Operation New Day. It seems like the same old terrible day, but okay. And they're jailing people for low-level offenses. Like we got the police reports last week. Like people are being arrested at Target for stealing literally baby formula and vitamins, right? And they're calling this like organized retail theft. They're trying to see how many more people can we put in our jail, while the COVID pandemic still rages in the jails, right? And so that sort of like cleaning up homelessness and poverty not by housing people or creating a universal basic income, but by like jailing them over and over again. At least it's a familiar play, but it's one that's like coming back like full force here, right? And so we see that, we're calling that out, and we're also focusing on building up our community-based responses to crisis, and also making bold demands to like house everybody, right? Like, yes, people are going to cause harm and going to hurt each other, and here are all the projects we have that we're now coordinating between each other. So we do have a civilian 911 crisis response, and also violence prevention, and like meet some basic needs, City of Seattle, and stop like using the money to try to recruit new cops, right? Like no new cop bonuses, no retention bonuses, all of that. I'll end with like some of the things we're learning. One is that like the city will go back to its old shape if we don't stay alert, right? Like this new shape cannot hold without constant, exhausting vigilance, right? And that's what makes our job hard. Like we need to be building out the new thing we want while fighting to dismantle the old thing, while fighting to hold on to the gains we have that we think might lead us to the new thing we're building, right? So it's like all of those things all the time together, whereas the city just keeps rehashing their like tired playbook. We also need to keep bringing in new people to keep this fight going, right? It's like another thing we're learning, right? There are moments where new people can be brought in huge waves, like the uprising, look, my timer, in 2020. And then there's moments like now, where you have to be like methodical and intentional about inviting those like 5 like committed dorks who you met that one time who seem like they might be willing to spend hours on the city budget and like hold an entire onboarding event just for them, right? Like that is just as important, right? So I guess I'll leave it there because I heard my own timer, and I'm excited to hear from Andrea.
Thank you so much, Angelica. It's so useful. All kinds of people are texting me to tell me how much they like everything you all are saying. Andrea, obviously you've been a really pivotal person in coordinating the work that people are doing all over the country to defund the police, especially through your work at Interrupting Criminalization. You've been providing trainings for people about like how to do this work, how to gather the data, how to deal with the police unions, just like all of these intense particular obstacles and strategies, and helping people cross-pollinate those strategies between cities. And I'm wondering if you would tell us just like some of your current thoughts about how the work is going, what lessons our people are learning in the fights, and especially just like because I think of you as someone who has a really broad view about these fights happening in a lot of different places, and obviously your much longer work in trying to end police violence that you've been doing, on so many fronts for so many years.
Thank you so much, Dean. Before I start, I'm a very light-skinned Black woman with blue rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a pale green shirt. I have curly hair that's really enjoying the humidity where I am. And I am coming to you from my mother's homeland of Jamaica. The original peoples here were the Taino, Arawak, and Carib peoples. And I'm really grateful to be joining this conversation, and also feel like, that the I am because we are, Ubuntu phrase really resonates with me in this moment, because there's nothing I'm doing that would be possible without the work of the 2 people you just heard from, and dozens more across the country. And so I just want, if folks take anything away from our State of the Union presentation tonight, the State of the Defund Union, I hope that people take away from it that the defund movement is absolutely not dead. It's far from it, no matter what any politicians or pundits or police might say about it. And that, in fact, if anything, it's gotten more coordinated, more skilled, more sophisticated, more deeply embedded in communities, and really just more determined to wrest power from police and resources from the state to make sure that our communities, our people, survive and experience safety in the ways that Angelica describes that we've actually never had because of police. And I think that is the main sort of takeaway here. And I think that people also need to see that, the thing that prompted this sort of declaration of, the end of defund movements, which is, again, as folks say, completely baseless, was the vote in Minneapolis. And I think around the ballot measure there that would have removed the requirement in the city's charter to maintain a police department of a particular size. So it would have paved the way for creating new approaches to public safety without the city literally being handcuffed to police as the only strategy through a city charter amendment. And people, characterize the failure of that ballot initiative as a sign that this movement was done. And in fact, I mean, all of us who have been working to divest from policing and invest in community safety have never seen nearly half of the voters in a city, 60,000 people, say we're ready for something different. And that was a huge win. And it is testament to the fact that of what we're talking about is how deeply people have been engaged in conversations with hundreds of thousands of people in their communities about what safety means, about what safety look like, about what safety requires, and what safety is not existing, to Erica's point, right now, as we continue to pour over $100 billion, up to $130 billion a year and counting into police. So I feel like that's the kind of biggest picture piece of it. The other thing that happened was that the city of Austin, organizers in the city of Austin, were able to fend off a ballot initiative that would have enshrined a requirement in their city charter, just like the one that folks in Minneapolis were fighting to remove, that would have required the city of Austin to maintain a police department of a particular size, that would have potentially bankrupted the city, that would have required the city to lay off all kinds of other public sector workers in order to maintain this artificially sized police force. And people defeated it by going door to door and talking to people in communities about, like, this is not what is going to increase safety in our city. And we know that, you know that, I know that. And what this will do is take money away from the things that will, and resources away from the things that will. So I think people are not we're not seeing coverage of the fact that people are successfully, as they are in Seattle, continuing to cut police department budgets, that people across the country are successfully fighting to keep American Rescue Plan Act funds out of the hands of cops and into communities' hands, that people are coming together for weekly. We came together for a year, 40 to 60 organizers across the country every week for learning communities to share strategies and tips and tools. Folks from Black Nashville Assembly who are here tonight are defund fellows. There were fellows in 17 cities who were learning from and strategizing with each other. Seattle also hosted a defund fellow. We at Interrupting Criminalization supported organizations across the country, including in Minneapolis. People are working together, learning together, and building together, and really being clear that we're entering a new phase of the struggle. So as you pointed out at the beginning, Dean, as we heard in other places, we're fighting a police state. They faced the greatest threat to their legitimacy in their lifetime, or in my lifetime, not in their lifetime, in my lifetime, which is much shorter than that of police. And the ferocity of their response to the defund demand is an indication of how powerful that demand was and is and remains. And the fact that it's still this conversation that's continuing, that people are continuing to try to declare it dead, is really a testament to the power of the demand and the power of the movement. And their response is indicative of how much ground they lost in 2020 in terms of legitimacy. I think particularly also that that an increasing number of people are being exposed to or understanding the lie that is police reform. And I think, when you declare that there's a ban on no-knock warrants, and then a mere lock is dead by no-knock warrant, when you declare there's, the end of this or this many prosecutions, like not one prosecution that's happened in the last 2 years has stopped the next killing and the next killing and the next killing and the next rape and the next beating and the next tasing and the next incarceration. And people are starting to get more and more clear that the things that we were demanding, even 2 or 3 years ago are no longer, they're not, or 2 or 3 months ago, we're recognizing that those are not answers. So I think that we're entering new phases of struggle on that front as well. And cops know that fear is their most reliable weapon. And so they've reached for it with a vengeance. And they've come out with, this wave. And as Ida B. Wells said, she described the media as accessory to lynch mobs. And the media continues to be an accessory to the police and to their death-making ways, and so fueled by and aided by and supported by the media and politicians, police have come back with this, notion of a massive crime wave and massive wave of violence hitting the country that is, supposedly caused by divestments from policing, which, and we've debunked that data. There's a publication called Cops Don't Stop Violence that Interrupting Criminalization put out, and many, many people are debunking the data and highlighting the biased reporting that's producing it, highlighting the fact that, cops are the ones who produce the data about crime, that not all crime is violence and not all violence is crime, as we're seeing right now at the border in the Ukraine, the violence that's being, visited on Black people trying to cross the border to escape war is not seen as a crime, right? And the violence of war is not seen as a crime, but the violence of wage theft is not seen as a crime, but the violence of taking diapers and things you need is. I'm really sorry, I don't know what that sound is, but it will stop. And that, so we're sort of debunking that. We're talking about the reality that Erica pointed out, which is that the violence that's happening now is happening on the cops' watch. Like, yes, violence is, we're not ignoring the fact that there is violence in our communities because we are experiencing it. We know that best. But it's happening under the current system. And it's precisely why we're calling for an end to the current system. We're pointing out that movements to defund police are survivor-led movements. They're movements led by people who are experiencing the violence, who are saying, I'm tired of money being poured more and more and more into something that's not actually stopping the violence that I'm experiencing, and it's actually increasing the violence that I'm experiencing. So I think we're coming to this by debunking the lies that the cops are telling, but we're also coming to this from a place that violence is real, and that need to address that violence is what we are here for. So we are the public safety, the people who are actually trying to create public safety. So I think that's shifting, and people, as the sort of new phase of struggle, as we're entering that, we are focused on building those safety strategies, the ones that Erica was talking about, the ones that the Black Brilliance report are talking about. How are we deepening and building those ecosystems of collective care that we need in order to create safer communities? We're also in this new phase of struggle. We're not shrinking, we're expanding, right? More and more people are doing what Erica and Angelica are talking about, saying we want to defund cops and courts and cages. We want to take the whole thing down, and borders and the military. And, we're looking at the whole picture. And I think also building our connections and understanding that housing is abolition and abolition is housing. Housing is, childcare is abolition and abolition is childcare. Ending climate crisis and injustice is abolition, and abolition requires ending climate crisis. Like that, we're making those connections, and we're not allowing ourselves to be divided in the ways that we have been before. We're really busting silos and really sort of recognizing, as we all know, the ways in which we're targeted by the state and by police are very intersectional. And so we need to resist in ways that are very intersectional, and that when we don't, we're just helping them do what they want to do. And then I think the last thing, there was a bunch of lessons that we kind of summarized in the defund police update that we put out in January of 2021 that are still, I think, sort of very valid. So I'll just ask that we drop that in the chat. But I think one of the real lessons that has come out in the last year has been that we really need a clearer vision of the world we're trying to build. We really need a better understanding of what kinds of systems of governance and what kinds of ways of relating to each other and to the planet we are trying to build. And that requires us to engage in study and historical study, in principled struggle, and to really grapple with tough questions around the role of the state, around what it means, what community control means and doesn't mean. We have to grapple with ideas of safety. Mariam talks a lot about safety not being a thing that you can be sold by the police or by a corporation or by the state. It's a relation, and that it's about building and understanding those relations. I think we're also learning the importance of unseating the notion of policing and criminalization itself, that we can't say things like treatment, not punishment, when treatment is another form of violence and incarceration, and when it's compulsory, when it's compelled, obviously, when it's done in the ways that Liat was breaking down last week and writes brilliantly about in her book, and that so many people from the Harriet Tubman Collective, people like Dustin Gibson and T.L. Lewis, and so many other people write about, Lydia X. Brown, in terms of the ways that also Prison by Any Other Name, which is a great book by Maya Shenwar and Vicky Law, talk about the ways in which the things that we think of as substitutes or alternatives to police are just police in new forms. So that we can't be, or in similar forms, or that they collaborate with police and often lead right back to police. So, for instance, Interrupting Criminalization has a project on how accessing medical care is a pathway to criminalization, and how, so treatment, not punishment, is actually treatment as punishment, and then treatment to punishment. So we need to be paying more attention to those things, and that requires us to really unseat the cops in our heads, as Paula Rojas writes, and in our hearts, right? We have to divest not just financially, but emotionally and ideologically from policing and punishment as connected in any way to our safety, our value, our worth, our lives. So those are some of the things. And I guess the last thing I would say is we're getting clearer, I think, at least in some sectors, about the fact that we need to be internationalists. And I think this moment makes it really clear that anti-Blackness is global, that the US is the global police, and that wherever, police and militarism and borders are connected, and certainly that's going to become even more relevant, not only through war, but through climate catastrophe, that we need to be fighting on all of those fronts and with comrades, and informed by comrades. Movements to defund, I learned about movements to defund police from South African anti-apartheid organizers. That was the first defund movement I was part of, to defund the state of South Africa, the apartheid state, or from folks working to boycott, divest, and sanctions on the state of Israel for its genocidal behavior towards Palestinian people and occupation of Palestine. And so there's a way in which we need to continue to build those connections and to build those relationships, so that we can create the kind of world in which we can build the societies that we really long for. And that's the last thing, is that we need to practice the world that we want every single day. And I think that's the piece also that people are learning, is that yes, there's the fight at the budget hearing, at the city council, and at the cop, trying to get the cop fired, or like, these are all clearly important parts of contending for power and fighting the power of the things that are hurting us, but we also need to practice the world that we want to fill the space with the world that we want. And that means self-accountability, that means accountability within organizations, that means accountability within communities, and that means practicing mutual aid in all the ways that you've taught us so much about, Dean. So that's my brief, hopefully, overview of where I see us at this moment.
So helpful. Thank you so much, Andrea and Erica and Angelica. We have about half an hour left, and I want to save time for audience Q&A. I'm torn by all the directions I want to go. And part of what I feel is like, you know, abolition isn't new, but we are in a very abrupt new phase of experimenting with this kind of municipal level intervention. Like, it's not new to do site fights and try to stop new police stations from being built, and invest, divest in many ways. You know, we practiced it before 2020, as you all described, and great examples of that. But there is something about like a lot of people in a lot of places suddenly doing city and county budget work and getting really deep and really tangled in that municipal level government, that I feel it makes me want to ask you all about kind of like what we're learning about what can and can't happen in those places, like what we're learning about the nature of how like municipal governments are even organized and who can be heard in them. Like, it makes me want to ask you about how it's relating for you to your thinking about electoral politics, because simultaneously we're seeing a lot of people experiment with running like further left candidates in local elections during the same period. And like in Seattle, we had a lot of defeats with that in the last election. So I'm just like, I'm thinking about all of that kind of experimentalism and torn about which place to take it. And part of it is that I just really want to hear what each of you are anticipating about the next phases of these fights. And some of those insights are like for all of us, and some of them are about like in particular localities, what's the next phase because of what the political weather is there. So I want to invite you to like respond to any of that, because we might not get to go through like all of these things individually. Yeah, and maybe I won't even like narrow it down. I mean, I also am curious about, obviously we've seen the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. We've seen, you know, the Biden administration's relentless continuation of attacks on immigrants and its fidelity to policing and imprisonment. So I'm just, you know, yeah, I'm curious about how you all are assessing these conditions and what you're anticipating, and how it is making you think about how we, when we decide to mess with government, how we do it and be building the kind of world we actually want to live in the ways that you're imagining. And I have a deep question always about, like as Angelica was talking about there at the end, like in some ways we're looking for really nerdy people who want to do a lot of public records requests and go to a lot of city council meetings and make sure they're not sneaking stuff by us. How do we keep that relevant to people who were in the streets in 2020 and might not be following closely the defund work even in their own city? Like, how do we deal with how technocratic the local government work is, and the need for the popular struggle and those incendiary moments that also, you know, make all of this possible and are where we see the horizon of like the world we want, in which lots and lots and lots of people are participating in the fight in a way that can be hard with something like the budget fights that becomes so technical. So that's a lot of stuff, but I just actually wanted to like let you all choose what you want to pick up, especially given what you heard from each other. And I'm just, let's see, any of you can start, even though I know it's sometimes nice when someone calls on someone. But I mean, Erica, we haven't heard from you in a while, so if you're willing to start, that's great. But if you want someone else to start, that's okay too.
Yeah, I can start. I'm really interested in what other folks have to say. One thing that I think I left out when I initially spoke, which feels relevant here, is like one of the major tools we use in our defund fight is participatory democracy. So I know folks named participatory budgeting. So we were like, we're going to model participatory budgeting, and of course the mayor like co-opted it, but not in a cute way. He was like, here's 1.5 or $2 billion and y'all play with it in the black part of town. And we were like, we actually want access to the whole budget. But I just said to say, like, we decided we would use participatory democracy as a path to like defund the police, or engage in invest, divest organizing. And so we use people movement assemblies. And a part of that, what we were learning and what we learn every single year, and Andrea knows because she works with us every single year. But when we try to create our surveys and talk to people about the budget, is people are like, I don't know anything about like how to disperse $1.5 billion. Like the biggest check I maybe written was like $3,000. I don't know, if that. And so folks are like having that question. And so we're trying to figure out how do we like talk about it in a way that people can digest and understand. And so I think that's one piece of it. But the other part of it is a part of really engaging in creating participatory policy making, deciding what laws and policies we support and what programs we want to implement, is like the leadership development and the political education. And so for the past like 2 years, we've just been a lot of adapting and building. And shout out to like the organizations I've been a part of who have been teaching us how to organize, like Song, Law for Black Lives, who've just been showing us how to do it and training us. But I think I'd say that because we started to use mass meetings as a way to engage in relationship building, but also political education. So before we could be like, yo, what y'all want to do with the judges and the district attorney race, we had to like do a full curriculum or a full lesson plan on judges, so people knew what they do. So people were like, oh, they elected for 8 years? What? I need to get my mom and them to vote this time, right? Like those things that folks hadn't considered because nobody had sat down and been like, yo, this is what's going on. And at the same time doing that with the budget. And so we're doing two things at one time. I think the other piece that feels important is we just really wanted to make sure we were able to invite people in to organize and activate people. And even as like the news is like, we're not trying to talk about invest, divest no more. We shut down city council again in 2021. The news was like, we're not going to talk about that. But what we have been doing is working really closely with creatives. So a part of our main organizing group is made of like hip hop artists and photographers and people who know how to make this shit sexy in ways that I can't. And so I think that's been gravitating too. And the other piece is we use those forums where we're like, yo, you're not Black if you're not throwing down with the Black National Assembly. So come holler at us, and we made sure we were like, this is what our politics, and this is how we're going to grow together. You ain't got to be perfect. But I think a part of that is we were like, if we're having anytime Black people gather, we wanted to be talking about the budget. We want to be talking about invest, divest. We want to be talking about abolition. So I think that has helped. Even when the media was like, we're not trying to do it, we were like, we're going to engage in digital organizing. We're going to always be in people's faces. People are going to see us in the Black t-shirts. We got a really small budget. We're going to be on the radio. We're going to be telling people to engage with us because for too long, elected officials have made decision makers without us on our behalf, and they've done it in favor of developers and corporations. And so I think it felt important, especially in a place where we have been talking about public safety, but also housing is a huge issue. And connecting, as Andrea said, housing to abolition, I think has really made it possible for us to organize more people and invite more people into the work because we've connected to their particular issues. Folks want to talk about education. And so we were like, yeah, we can actually put more money into education and hold the education system accountable if we take the money away from cops, courts, and cages. And it's so interesting because we are seeing some decision makers start having that language, and because people have been talking to them for so long, for the past 2 years, and prior to that. But I think we recognized in 2020 and 2019 this would be long work. And then we just really decided that we were going to base build, that we were going to organize Black people in Nashville. And what's been really beautiful, this time last year, we were talking to a group of folks and we were like, yo, y'all want to join our coalition and get around this invest, divest shit? Y'all trying to defund the police with us? And they were like, our community's not ready for that. And we're like, okay. And they're like, we know that the police are horrible. And this is what they were like, we know they're horrible, but we're not ready for that. And so when it came time, we kind of did like a organic, let's stop license plate readers, which is an opportunity for us to see where organizations were so we could create kind of like a popular mass. And folks who had been like on the fence came out and were like, we're not for license plate readers, but also we don't want y'all to put more money into police, more resources into police. We want it to go to our people. And so we're seeing is we're having more conversations. And I think the data helps, but it's actually just spending time with people, to be in conversation that is moving people. And I think that's what the work has to be going forward. We got to keep talking to our neighbors and our family members and pulling up to the church and the barbecues and inviting people into the work.
Thank you so much, Erica. Angelica, Andrea, you want to jump in? Go for it, Angelica. Do it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah. I guess I'm thinking a lot about like the role, like, because I've just learned so much about city government from just being all up in their business for the past 3 years in a really intense way. And I think part of what's been unique about Seattle that might be different from somewhere like New York is that we literally have 9 city council members, right? So like we can get to all of them. Like if we want to, which we did one time, we can do, we were trying to override a mayoral veto. So we did a Labor Day override to every single council district. Like you can do that in Seattle because of the size of the city. So that's part of what informs my thinking on municipal governance is like the size and the scope, right? And I guess the most helpful thinking I found from them on this has been from Drumbeats, from Desi's Rising Up and Moving in New York. And they came up with sort of like a series of questions for thinking about, they're talking about like, when you're, a rad abolitionist organ or thinking about like endorsing an elected or what are the sorts of questions you ask? And a couple of questions that really resonate for me are, do they use their identity to make claims about representation or about substance, right? Like, I think that's just so foundational for if we're thinking about like running candidates or supporting candidates, or do we get involved or not when candidates decide to run, even though no one asked them to. And then secondly, like, and this I've really come to value is, are they skilled and capable of organizing other electeds, right? Because oftentimes, like, yeah, you can get that one person who's like, yes, I'm on board. But if they can't organize literally their own workplace, like their own colleagues or other legislative aides, or to bring folks on board, like they're not that helpful to us, right? Like, yes, having the one person can be helpful to say the one rad thing, but we really need folks who are able to organize it and bring other people along without selling us out, right? Without watering down our demands. And so like those two things to me have I think about those a lot in terms of if and when we engage in sort of the electoral space, because I also know that like the makeup of the council and having people who were not just about representation, but about substance, with some limitations, and also were skilled and capable at organizing their colleagues, is what helped us like hold the majorities we needed for some of these really tough votes, right? So I think that's my thoughts on that. In terms of, sort of our relationship to municipal governance, when we made the demand about participatory budgeting, a big part of it was, look, we know that like part of the reason almost a quarter of our city's general fund, the money that can go to all city services, is tied up in police and police pensions, is because, the mayor, so one person decides a budget, and then these 9 electeds basically amend it. And we all just sort of like fight for our little pieces of it separately, right? We said, no more, we're going to come together around solidarity budget and make these joint demands. But we also want every year a bigger and bigger chunk of the budget to be in people's hands directly, right? And that is very threatening to the city. So actually, even though that was voted on in November 2020, the process is just kicking off now, right? It's been like years of just being like, just stop getting in the way of this. And we're finally, maybe fingers crossed, at the point where it's going to get kicked off. But like, I'm very excited about it, despite the intense delays that have just been a fight to get this off the ground, because I feel like that is a space to sort of like practice a world we want, right? In the way that Andrea was talking about, right? That's like where people get plugged in, where it's like, you may or may not be like pro defund SPD, but defund SPD got this pot of money. And like, what do you need? Like, what are you seeing in your neighborhood And like, how can we meet people's material needs with city money? And also like, I don't know if it's going to work, but I do know that like folks are going to come together, I hope, are going to meet each other, are going to be practicing talking to each other and making decisions together, and hopefully laying the groundwork for like mutual aid and mutual survival, right? That we know is going to be so needed with the coming and like present climate catastrophes, right? And so I think even as we make these demands of the city, it's not because I'm, you know, like the people in the city can co-govern and I have this like super thought out plan for co-governance. It's more that I'm like, we have to practice new ways of being with each other and relating to each other. And these like local municipal governance structures give us an opportunity to do that. So like, I'm all for it, especially if it also means pulling money from police.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Andrea, you want to dive in?
Sure. I had to think about these things a lot because, you know, Mariam and I just were working on this book. So we had to think about like, what are we thinking is next? And I think one thing that really stood out to me from what both of you just said, but also from just the conversations around the country over the past year, is that we need to organize. We're organizers. We need to organize people, and we need to shore up our power to build the world that we want in the ways that both of you were just describing. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore said in a lecture recently that Interrupting Criminalization co-sponsored is, you know, the job of an abolitionist is to knock on people's door and say, hi, I'm Andrea Richie, I'm an abolitionist, and I'm here to solve your problems. Because pretty much any problem you have, I guarantee can be solved by what I've got in mind. But I think this piece about saying our people aren't ready, I think we have to push past that. It's our job to organize them to what, you know, some people weren't ready for Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman organized them to be ready for her, and some people were never ready for her, but enough people organized to change the conditions, right? And so we need to take that seriously and be in our communities in the way that both of you were talking about, right? Be in deep conversation about what people's needs are, what safety looks like and feels like to them, what needs to happen. And then I think also, so to the point in the chat, you know, Christina's saying, you know, we need to break the association between cops and public safety. And it's really deeply embedded because they put it there. They put it there through propaganda. I mean, one of the things we write about in No More Police is that everyone from a series of generations were forced to read Lord of the Flies, which is a book about supposedly what happens when there's no police. It's not a true story. There is a true story of some young men who were shipwrecked from Tonga who actually had a very cooperative, safe, and flourishing community without police. But that's not the story we're told, right? Everything tells us that we need police to be safe, and elders have been told that they need police to be safe for a long time, and so for longer. And so it is about sort of really breaking that mirage of safety in folks' heads, and I think that feels really critical. And I think to the part about backlash, I think someone raised a question in the chat about backlash, particularly in Minneapolis. I mean, if you're in Minneapolis, you can speak better to the backlash than any of us can. But I think, you know, we have to not be deterred by that. We have to continue to organize people to our position. And if people are changing position, then we have to understand that we weren't ever in the same place. And we have to continue to organize them to our position. It's a protracted struggle. So I just want to name that. Also to be careful not to go down dead ends. And I think that campaigns that legitimize institutions that we're trying to dismantle are dead ends. And I don't think the words progressive and prosecutor can be in the same sentence. It's not possible. I believe in unicorns. I don't believe in progressive prosecutors. So like, I think unicorns are more likely than progressive prosecutors. And so I think we have to kind of check the balance between our harm reduction strategies. What are we doing to reduce immediate harm so that more people can stay out of cages to fight? And what's that impact on our long-term strategy? So I think those are just constant battles we have to make. And I've fallen into traps too, many times. Let me just be clear. Like, I fight police sexual violence. there's so many traps you can fall into that actually legitimize police departments. More policies, more trainings, more discipline, more accountability that just legitimize, they pink wash a police department into looking like it's not an institution that's actually about sexual violence, that is inherently sexually violent. And so we have to, but also I want to reduce harm. I'm a survivor of police sexual violence. I want it to stop. I want to have fewer people experience it. So I think we end up in these, and that's just a constant place we end up in tension. I think in the last question I want to just quickly touch on in the chat and then be quiet is this question about how we move at a speed that brings and accounts for everyone in our communities, including disabled folks. And many of us who do that, just like many of us who are leading this work and in this movement are survivors, many of us are also disabled and are in this work because we want abolition of all of the institutions that incarcerate and deny us the things that we need. And we want resources to support all of us in all the ways that our minds and bodies appear on the planet. And so I do think that means we need to address some of what Angelica was talking about in terms of the exhausting pace at which we work. And I think that means we need to incorporate disability justice and healing justice in our work beyond ASL interpretation that people like me usually talk too fast for, or sort of naming the issue, but really thinking about how our organizing is accessible to and creating it and centering all of our experiences in it. So that's the last thing I wanted to just lift up and agree with and name and pass the mic.
I just want to pull one thread that you said, Andrea, because I think it's so important. Like this piece where we've had all these public officials and other important people, like, perform caring about anti-Black police violence in the wake of 2020 and then make promises and walk them back or say that they're accomplished when they're not. I just think it's so useful to remember. I feel like there's something about the battle of ideas, in particular on social media, that makes people think we're trying to convince people of something, but we're actually trying to pressure people to do something. And it's really distinct. And it's like these are not like individuals with minds. They're people in positions, and the positions themselves are designed to protect like a white supremacist colonial system. And they only move because we force them to move. And we've just seen this so much in all of our local fights in Seattle about jails and prisons and police stations. Like, it doesn't matter who these people say they are, what they say they believe in. They're just going to do what's convenient to what the political weather is forcing them to do. And we're trying to create an environment in which it's impossible to hire another cop. It's impossible to pass another budget that has these resources for police. It's impossible to propose building a jail or police station because you will go down. That's not like quick work. And that is like, there's a moment of uprising and it seems like a lot of people are having a tip in their tongue, and then people walk it back as far as they possibly can. And then that's a test of us. And we have to be like, no, the pressure. I just really like, it's warfare. It's like, instead of that, it's like a battle of ideas. I feel like that's just really helpful, because that's like the thing we need is huge people power and the ability to demonstrate that people power with solidarity around sort of like on every front around like the transit fights and the cops in schools fights and the budget fight and there's just this illusion we're living under that if the right things get said in the right media, that'll do it. And I feel like all the work that you three are doing and are connected to is really about something else, which is like relentless pressure that is very demanding and really needs, like, I think it's like the piece around exhaustion. It's like our movements need to figure out ways to be much bigger and have many more people holding all the pieces of the work. And that is difficult when the work is highly technocratic and is behind city council doors and all of this stuff. It's like, and also when people pop up in the streets, but then also are struggling with the conditions of the pandemic and all of these other things and may not stay engaged. Like, I think for me, a central question is like, how do we sustain huge amounts of participatory engagement in the work long term. And our movements are constantly trying to learn about that. And the things you said, I think, about disability justice in our way of doing the work, and things Angelica was saying about how we recruit people to the work, and the things Erica was saying about like coalitional work and multiple organizations bringing people together, making certain conversations happen every time people are gathered. Like, these are just like really brilliant clues I see in what you all are saying. We have 5 minutes left. You all, like me, are looking at how Sophie is bringing questions from the chat into a special list for us. I wondered if any of you want to address any of the questions that Sophie has pulled out of the chat for us, or anything else that's been said.
Yes, one thing I would add, Dean, to what you were saying about like this is not quick work and like elected's pressure. Like, to me, it's a much more interesting thing to think about, like, you know, who should we elect for this position? But like, who are the people who are currently in this position? I don't care who they are, really. Like, do they answer to, right? And so like one answer in Seattle of like the people that we could get to that they answer to was labor, right? And so we spent a tremendous amount of time with the unions, right? Because once we got the unions on board with the fight to kick out the Seattle Police Officers Guild from their like guild, their union club, then they were like, okay, what's next? And I was like, great. Like, these 3 council members are wobbling. We need you to call them, right? And like, council members don't care, you know, what me or my relatively small group think, but they do care what this union with like all its membership who turn out to reelect them think, right? So like, it's also that it's like, how do we make it politically impossible? And then also like, oh my God, we're organizing the unions. Like, there are probation officers who are unionized. There are like, you know, all these other workers who are unionized. How can we get them like out of those jobs and into other jobs and like signed on to this idea of abolition, right? So it's like finding these different entryways, and like some of it, like if I hadn't engaged in that city work at that level, I wouldn't have made these relationships.
I wanted to, I think one question that really is standing out to me is like, how do abolitionists feel about being involved in progressive DA and now sheriff races? And I think like sheriff and of course, police, which isn't elected, like totally like, you know, fuck them all together. And the DA and judicial races I'm really curious about, because we were being invited in or called in about not doing enough accountability work. Like, we were like, you're spending a lot of work in city council, but our people are being like, literally their lives are being taken by the district attorney and the judges. And so we're having these complicated conversations at the very least about saying, hey, these are the people in these positions. And like, one thing we're going to do is we're going to talk bad about the people in these positions, whether it's like in person or digitally or online, to name this is what's happening, to really, and one thing that has been asked of us from people who are experiencing the criminal legal system is to talk about what's happening inside of those halls, because it's oftentimes an isolated experience. And I think what we want to be able to do is think about how do we escalate both on city council, on the judicial process, right? Delegitimize it while lifting up how corrupt and wrong it is. And at the same time, building out programs that exist totally outside of it, while also trying to hold the line around public tax dollars should not be privatized. So we're doing a dance and trying to land, because even when we're like, yo, like I said, let's invest in public goods. And we were like, yo, invest in housing, invest in healthcare, but realizing, right, that those things too are faulty, right? And in some ways, like, re-legitimize because of their connection to the prison industrial complex, like that complexity. So again, I think it goes back to having the relationships necessary to have those tough conversations and figure out how we navigate it as a body. And so for us, we use the assembly process to make decisions. But also it means, you know, because we organize, we got to have conversations prior to the assembly and set the framework so that it acts or and responds in the way that is abolitionist. But I think that for us, we cannot like endorse any candidate, one, because we're not a C4, but even if we were like, we're going to do something cute and say the Nashville Black Assembly, something different, we couldn't endorse any candidates. But what is interesting is we do have a few folks who have been a part of the assembly since we started, the Black National Assembly, who are now running for judge, right? And so we're like, oh, what does that look like? Because we invited all Black people into a body to analyze our issues and create solutions. And so, and in doing that, we were like, here's the structures, here are the limits. Like we're Black queer feminists. We work from a Black queer feminist lens. We use invest, divest, which we're really clear about. We're abolitionists and we're anti-capitalist. And so what does it look like when y'all decide to run for judge or run for city council or be on the COB? And how do we then hold you accountable? And, you know, maybe we can have a part 2 where we can tell y'all what that looks like in November. But yeah.
Thank you. We have virtually no time left, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity, Andrea, if you just want to say a last word for us.
I don't want to say the last word, but I do want to say that, yes, I just want to knock on what Erica's saying about like living with those tensions is where we're sitting, right? Like we don't want to create, we want to invest in public goods, but not policed public goods. Is it possible for a state to create public goods that aren't policed in some way? If not, how are we practicing new forms of governance? Those are the tensions that we're sitting in, and we have to lean into them. And I just wanted to answer this question briefly about how do you stay focused to not get derailed by causes and bills and changes that look like they're moving towards the end goal, but in the end facilitate oppression. And Sophie's going to share in the chat the critical resistance chart that always I turn to. And I actually want you to share also as a last word, Dean, some of the things I've learned from you about what to look for. But, you know, number one, is this improving the material conditions of people who are currently being harmed by the system? Is it giving them more money? Is it giving them less jail time? Is it getting them out from under the taser, the boot, the whatever? And is it diminishing the power, the scope, the legitimacy, the resources, the ability of those institutions to do harm? And they have to do both. And we have to think about whether we're preventing the harm or dealing with it after the fact. I love that everyone discovered qualified immunity last summer. It's the bane of all 3 of our lawyers' existences. And that's about it's about changing something that will change things after the person's been killed or beaten or raped. And it's a very the likelihood that a change to that is going to make a difference or prevent police violence is 0. I'm not going to waste any time on that, even though I hate it as a doctrine and I would like to get rid of it. And so I think we have to really make those kinds of calculations about, are we stopping the violence? Are we stopping the power? Are we moving resources to things we need? Are we improving people's material conditions? And that always, always, always has to be the test, the bellwether, the test point.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for taking time to be part of this event. Thanks so much to Jess and Kat, the interpreters, and to the captioner, and especially to the people at Seattle University and Barnard for making this whole thing happen, and to everybody who joined us and spoke all of your wisdom and questions and engagements into the chats. Exactly what we need to be doing to do all the work in our own communities. So yeah, onward. Thanks a lot.